In a lawsuit filed in 2023 against the city of South Charleston, a man was told he was not able to engage in beekeeping on his property. The West Virginia Department of Agriculture soon became involved. Our Haley Lanham has the details of the lawsuit.
Alex Urban, a resident of South Charleston, petitioned to keep honeybees on his property and was denied. The city enacted an ordinance prohibiting residents to keep domesticated animals, including bees. The West Virginia Department of Agriculture intervened in November of 2024 within the case to protect its regulatory authority over honeybees. The West Virginia Department of Agriculture had argued that the city of South Charleston exceeded its legal authority by attempting to regulate honeybees, a responsibility that is designated exclusively to the state under the West Virginia Apiary Act.
Beekeeping is so important for our food supply. Without those bees and the pollination, we wouldn't have an abundant food supply here in the United States. So that's number one, why it's very important to me. And it should be important to every citizen in the country as well as West Virginia. It also shows the authority of the Department of Agriculture, and we don't overstep our bounds. We work very hard to be respectful of everybody, but bees are one thing that, you tell a beekeeper that you can't keep bees. Well, wait a minute. The bees are going to come to your yard anyway.
One local beekeeper in Elizabeth, West Virginia, who has been around bees since he was 7 years old with his grandfather, spoke out about the importance of honeybees.
80% of all of our food, or basically anything that gets pollinated, 80% of it is pollinated by 3 different species, and that's it. The honeybee, the bumblebee, and the butterfly.
After taking this to court, the court found that classifying bees as animals was invalid. Bees do not fall under the definition of animals as outlined in the West Virginia State Code 8-12-5.
Bee is considered a farm animal. We're governed under the Department of Agriculture, and that's one of the rights we have. We're allowed to have bees. According to the West Virginia Supreme Court, we follow under that law. We're allowed to have bees anywhere. A city can't tell us by ordinance that we cannot now because of that ruling.
As a result of the case, beekeepers statewide can have reassurance that they can continue to operate and contribute to local agriculture. This was a huge victory for beekeepers, farmers, and the state of West Virginia. Agriculture is growing in the state of West Virginia, and if they had lost the case, it would have caused a huge setback in agriculture, according to Leonhard. But even after the ruling, they may not be out of the woods just yet.
We did receive recently the notice of appeal, so it looks like the city of South Charleston doesn't agree with the judge's order and is going to appeal the case.
In Parkersburg, I'm Haley Lanham with WTAP News.